myself, Paul Hewett, and Tim Bell. So just before Tim introduces himself, just a small story that's basically data marketer and a legal guy. We walk into a bar in Texas. Tim has just done a presentation on GDPR at South by Southwest, and I was in the audience, and we could see everyone's jaws hit the ground when they realized the obligations that were heading their way. And Tim and I got talking, and having been involved with Travel Massive, I thought it was a really, really good opportunity to bring Tim's knowledge and my knowledge on GDPR to this forum. So that's kind of how this all happened. It was done. The fact that we're both English is just coincidental. Yeah, Tim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. So I'm Tim Bell, Managing Director with DPR Group. As Paul said, we met after I delivered a session on GDPR in Texas, and it's always interesting, I think, to see people's reactions when they find out that the new European laws can affect them as well. But we'll go on to that in a bit, and I'll let Paul take it on the first section.
Great, thank you, Tim. Okay, just a bit of a disclaimer. So this is a general presentation on GDPR, and it's aimed to help you move towards compliance, and we're going to help you kind of identify some of the risk that you may be exposed to. And anything that you hear in this does not substitute for legal advice. Okay, so it's really important that we get that across. And actually, if there are any questions in this, we'll happily answer questions either at the end of the presentation or via emails. But if there's a particularly tricky issue, then you must take legal advice on this. Okay. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at why GDPR matters to non-EU companies and why it matters to travel companies. To warn everyone, we've got a hell of a load of slides. Okay, so what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and get through as many of these as fast as possible. And I suspect you'll all have lots of questions at the end, so please make note of those and as we go, and you'll have the opportunity to ask when we get to the end. So the first thing I want to get across when we're talking about data, I mean, we love data. Okay, so personal data. As marketers, it's kind of the lifeblood of what we do now. Most of the things that we do is data driven, but also we understand that consumers want the right to protect that. So everything that we're going to talk about is in a really positive light. We want to get hold of data, but we want to use it in the best possible way. So just to frame the conversation, the amount of data that we are collecting at the moment is just the tip of the iceberg. It's growing day by day, and the type of data that we are collecting is continuing to change. So currently we're mostly capturing structured data, text, that kind of thing, but as you'll see in a moment, we're actually moving into a new era of data collection where biometric data is being collected on a personal level and stored on a personal level. And to give you an idea of where we expect that to be by 2020, we're looking at zettabytes of data. So basically the amount of data being collected at this point in time is equivalent to an audio recording of every single word spoken by every human ever. That's how much data is being collected at the moment and stored at the moment. So we're talking about vast amounts of data that is going to be growing at an exponential rate, and a lot of that data is going to be pinned back to people. So things like videos, photographs, or biometric data, facial scans, all of that sort of stuff. And to highlight that, I wanted to just kind of pick out some of the things that we're seeing in the industry at the moment. So if any of you are big technology fans like me, you'll be watching Alibaba closely. And in this picture here on the right-hand side, we've got a picture of Jack Ma showing the facial recognition technology that Alibaba is launching. And they've actually got a number of subsidiary companies that are using that data for commercial purposes. So in China recently, the first Smile to Pay application was launched. So most of us are probably aware. I'm going to admit now I go to McDonald's on a regular basis, and if you saw me, you wouldn't be surprised. But you'll be aware of the screens that we have in most McDonald's these days that are replacing cashiers. And Alibaba's technology is allows the consumer to smile to make that final payment. So it looks at your facial movements, it looks at your smile, it looks at your teeth, and is able to gauge whether it's you. The technology, I was looking into it, is actually very robust. You can't trick it with pictures. It needs a real face. So, I mean, that's very exciting, but also very scary, because where does that data go, and how is it held, and how long for, and lots of questions about that. And then the final picture is just something that we're all familiar with, which is biometrics in airports. Obviously, that's a huge part of kind of the travel experience now. So bringing this a bit closer to home, I've got a couple of slides here. This is some work that Expedia has been doing. So they are using the facial, not so much facial recognition, but the eye tracking, basically, to figure out what part of the digital experience you like, and then craft a bespoke holiday for you. But again, the same questions apply. When your camera kicks in and it tracks your eyes and your face, again, what processes are sitting behind that? To is your whole face being recorded? Is it just your eye movement that's being recorded? And again, we have the same questions of where is that data kept? How is it processed? How long is it kept for? Is it appended to my IP address? All of those things. And this is primarily what GDPR is concerned with. So very quickly, just an example of when data goes bad, personal data. This is a real world scenario happening in 4 cities in China at the moment. So heavily surveilled population, and the cameras are actually tracked with using facial recognition. And they're being used for things like picking up minor infringements such as jaywalking. So in the top left-hand corner, we've got a member of the public who has jaywalked. They've scanned his face, and not only do they publicly publish that on social media and at tube stations, that facial scan is appended to a criminal database. Yeah, so that's obviously not a great thing for the citizens of these 4 particular Chinese cities. So now on to Tim's section about data breaches.
Yes, absolutely, and this will be something that I imagine is very familiar to all of you. And rather than looking at some of the cases in Facebook's history, which are actually not necessarily long distant history in some cases, and how particularly Max Schrems, who's a privacy activist in Europe, how he's been really seeking redress from Facebook in Ireland for a number of years. But we've seen over the last month the Cambridge Analytica issues and everything that's been happening around that with Facebook. And that's not only shown the risks to business as far as costs, and we saw actually the value of Facebook drop by 50 billion, which is an extraordinary amount of money, off the back of those revelations of what was being done with the data that Facebook was providing to their contractors. But also it's created a loss of face. It's a loss of respect and a loss of trust for those customers of Facebook who are now thinking, actually, can I trust this company with my data? And what are my alternatives? And as soon as you've got consumers being concerned about how the data is being treated by a company, that's when they're going to start looking around at alternatives. And there's been a number of other cases in against Facebook. Be familiar with the Snowden ones, I'm sure, where Snowden actually revealed that a lot of the information that's coming into the US, including those the data that Europeans provide on Facebook, that was actually being surveilled by the NSA, and details kept on that. And if we can go on to the next slide, we can see WhatsApp, which is in fact now also a subsidiary of Facebook. They got in trouble in Holland a couple of years ago for not appointing a local representative as part of the Holland's enactment of the of the previous regime of data protection laws. They received a 1 million fine in euros for that. And then last year, and this was a really interesting one with the connection between WhatsApp and Facebook, the fact that WhatsApp, although a very safe and encrypted platform, was sharing the data that they were seeing on their platform with Facebook, who were then issuing adverts to those individuals. So if you were chatting to a friend on WhatsApp about wanting to go on holiday to Germany, let's say, suddenly you'd be finding adverts for German holidays on your Facebook profile. And then moving on again, the Uber breach and the massive Uber breach that happened, and the fact that Uber had to eventually put their hands up to it. That type of issue, were that to happen under GDPR, and we'll see in a minute the risks that come with that, but the fines would have been quite extraordinary. And I mean, certainly it's not over for UBS on this. They haven't fully faced the music on it, but it's nowhere in the same scale that it would have been had this type of event happened when GDPR was in place. So what is GDPR? And this is the key question, and how does it affect you? And those are really, I'm sure, what people are really keen to hear. GDPR is it's the new European law that's been put in. It's a regulation, so it applies directly to all European countries without them a need to bring that into law separately, although many countries actually are doing so. And it benefits all individuals within the EU. Any person who's in the EU, and that's not just European citizens, but also citizens of other countries who are based in the EU at that time, are protected, and their personal data they now have, or they will have with effect from the 25th of May, only now 16 days away, they'll have a certain number of rights in respect to their data, and they'll be able to exercise those rights and complain to the local EU authorities who will take up that cause for them. It replaces the 95 Act, and that's sorry, thank you. The old regime was created in 95, pre-internet really. I mean, the internet was at very early stages, so none of this volume of data, the zettabytes that Paul mentioned, none of that was a reality at that stage. So it was very much a need to bring it up to date. And here we are, 2 weeks on Friday, and we're going to be facing the reality of that GDPR situation. So, and this is the key, and this is absolutely the key. I'm sure many in the audience here aren't from Europe, probably the majority. And the key thing is that it is directly enforceable against you in your own countries. And what will happen likely is that the method that this will be achieved is the individual will bring their concerns to the local EU authorities. Those authorities will then look into those issues, and if they decide that GDPR has been breached by a company outside of Europe, then they'll be placing fines on that company, potentially placing other penalties, and then looking to enforce those in the local courts in those jurisdictions. And the key thing will be that those jurisdictions will politically find it very hard not to enforce the GDPR rights, because each of those countries, in order to trade with Europe, needs to have a legal structure in place that enables them to enforce data protection laws. And any country which is seen as not enforcing data protection laws will likely find it very hard to do business with Europe in the future. And the key part of this that identifies this territorial scope is Article 3.2. So Article 3.1 identifies that companies in Europe are affected by GDPR, and that was always apparent. But Article 3.2 says that if you're a company based outside of Europe, if you sell products or services into Europe, or if you monitor individuals in Europe, and monitoring there is quite a wide description. It includes simply as much as putting a cookie on your website and monitoring what pages people are looking at and possibly where they're based and how long they're on your website. Because you can use that IP address information to trace it back to the individual, you'll be monitoring that individual, and those acts in themselves, even having a cookie on your website, will likely place you under the regime of GDPR. And this is the really key bit. This is the bit that usually makes the jaws drop to the floor, and the certainly senior executives in companies start sweating quite heavily, is the massive fines that are potentially there. The fines, as you see on the side, but it's worth saying out loud just to be clear that these are actually genuine. Up to 20 million euros, or 4% of global revenue, and it's the greater of those two which is the effect. So if you've got a company which brings in billions and billions, then your potential fine could be absolutely massive. And the reason for that is that the Facebooks and the Ubers and the WhatsApps of this world, unless you have a sufficient penalty that's actually going to make them take notice, it's going to be really hard to actually make any of them pay attention. And this was the problem with the old regime, that the penalties and the fines were actually very small. So it was really worth, Facebook would do better from scraping that data and treating it in the way that it has and paying the fines afterwards than they would have done from acting in the correct way that they should have done in the first place. And I think the next, in fact, yeah, this is a great slide here. This is an example of the kind of fines that some groups of companies could face. So where you do have companies who have a turnover of a certain level, that 20 million is the maximum. But as soon as your group's profit starts to creep into the potentially tens and hundreds of billions, then you can be looking at a fine, when you're looking at 4% of global turnover, that really is very sizable. I mean, look here at travel companies like Expedia. When you look at the overall profit of their group in the last year, the 4% would equate to around about a $2 billion, beg your pardon, fine. And Google, as I'm sure you're not surprised, with the size of their organisation and Alphabet and as the parent company, their fine could be looking at over $4 billion. So it really is something that makes people take notice. And the intention really is to enforce globally. And this, it really can't be overstated. This is one of the prime drivers from Europe in bringing the new regulation in, is that they realise they can do whatever they want in Europe, but unless they can actually bring some force to bear on the Facebooks and the WhatsApps, it really offers very little value, because so much of that data is now outside of Europe, and they'll be doing their absolute best. They'll be using every method that they have available to make sure that they're enforcing it against companies around the world. And that's the key. And this is really what we want to make clear on this presentation. It is a really big point that I like to bring at every stage, is that GDPR and observing your customers and your data subjects' privacy rights is a fantastic opportunity. This is something that consumers are going to be increasingly looking at when they're deciding which supplier to purchase from. And if your organisation is the organisation that presents the gold standard for privacy, that has the very best data security and the best consents, the best ways of dealing with their customers' data, then that is going to be a significant advantage to those companies when they're going out to the market and attempting to sell their products. The really key thing is, make sure you're asking your customers for consent. Tell your customers what you're going to do with the data, and tell them how you're going to protect that data. And this is really some of the key bits about GDPR, is making sure those individuals are aware of what you're doing and that they have agreed that you can do what you are then doing with their data.
Okay, so we're going to have a look now at why travel websites and companies should pay close attention. So just quickly looking at a small example of the travel market by its very nature. the travel market is a global market. So if we look at this example of Singapore here, where we've got theme parks, car rentals, hotels, by being travel businesses, they're actively targeting people in Germany, in United Kingdom, in Spain, all within the EU bloc. So the travel industry, from my perspective, is quite a high risk from a GDPR perspective. So even companies with a country-specific top-level domain. So this is a real example here. So in this particular case, this is a company that has a .co.uk, .fr, .sg, .cn, .com.au. They've got a really good global setup for their website. But if you look at the .com.au, you can see that EU users are still creeping into that. So in this instance, we've got 1,733 European users finding their way to the website each month, which doesn't sound like a problem until you look at the cookies that are being fired off. So typically with most websites, you have your analytics one. So if you're using Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, usually that data is absolutely fine. There's a note against that in a moment. Because the data is anonymized at the point of capture. Okay, so there's no IP address. You're not capturing personal information. You're not getting an email address out of it. You're anonymizing the data at the point of collection. But then there are three further types of cookies, and the worst kind, really, from a protection, data protection perspective, are any form of personalization and advertising. So for instance, if this company does fire cookies that will, they've got DoubleClick, they've got Floodlight, they've got Criteo, all of these advertising and remarketing cookies, they're actually collecting personal data. They're monitoring where they're moving on the website. They're monitoring other web activity, and they're serving ads up based on that data. In this instance, even though this company has got a country-specific top-level domain, they're in breach of the data GDPR. So the note about PII data. So again, this is a different company now, but PII data, your analytics data cookie is fine normally, okay, as long as it's set up in line with the Google terms. However, most of the websites that we see these days are actually pulling personally identifiable information into the analytics setup. So in this instance, we've got passwords, we've got usernames, we've even seen telephone numbers, we've seen gender, we've seen it all. In Google Analytics, because people are doing complex form setups, they're syncing the data with their CRM, and as a result, in this particular instance, yeah, we've even got transaction amounts in there, so how much that person is paying, and we've even seen very recently amount and the person's address, the person's telephone number. So the point is, this is a data protection breach. By the EU standards, you will get fined for this, but worse than that, well, not worse than that, but on par with that, it's against Google terms. And what Google will do if they spot this, and they're getting better at spotting it, is they will terminate your Google Analytics account and they will wipe all data out, and they won't give you any notice of that. So even if you've got 10 years data, hundreds of millions of sessions, that data is gone and there is no retrieving it, okay? So one thing I would warn is to get your web analytics company to have a good look in your web data and make sure that you're not capturing any personally identifiable information within